Captain Adrian Graves stood on the observation deck of the Elysium, watching the stars streak by as the warship sliced through the vast emptiness of space. It was hard to imagine that just a few years ago, this ship had only existed as a blueprint, a dream of the Empire's most brilliant minds. Now, it was reality. A reality that would shape the course of human history. The Elysium was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Its sleek, obsidian hull gleamed with a dark, almost menacing beauty as it powered its way through the stars. Armed with weapons capable of eradicating entire fleets in seconds, it was the embodiment of humanity's new era of dominance. To the Empire, it represented the pinnacle of military might. To its enemies, it was a symbol of inevitable destruction. Graves' thoughts drifted to the weight of the responsibility that came with leading this powerful vessel. He was a seasoned officer, known for his strategic brilliance and unwavering loyalty to the Empire. But even he couldn't ignore the whisper of doubt that had begun to settle in his mind. As the captain of the Elysium, he was tasked with enforcing order across the galaxy. But what if this order came at too high a cost? The warship's maiden mission loomed ahead. A mission to a contested world on the fringe of Empire-controlled space. The planet, Verdun 7, was teetering on the edge of rebellion. Once a prosperous trade hub, it had become a battleground between warring factions, each with their own vision for the planet's future. The Empire had sent numerous peacekeeping forces, but they were either overwhelmed or unwilling to take decisive action. That's where the Elysium came in. With its unimaginable firepower, the ship would obliterate any resistance with a single strike, securing the Empire's rule in a matter of hours. At least, that's what the Imperial High Command promised. Graves stood tall, his gaze fixed on the holographic map of Verdun 7, analyzing the intelligence reports. There were civilians caught in the crossfire, millions of innocent lives caught between the warring factions. He had been briefed about the planet's strategic value, but the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the image of those civilians, the families, the children, who would suffer when the Elysium unleashed its devastating firepower. His first officer, Commander Lena Grays, approached, her face grim. "Captain, we're approaching the outer orbit of Verdun 7. The resistance forces are already massing. The Empire wants us to engage." Graves turned to her, his jaw tightening. "What's the status of the civilians?" he asked. "Conflicting reports, sir. Some say they've already been evacuated, but others suggest they're being used as shields by the rebels." Graves clenched his fists. "Prepare for a tactical assessment. We're not firing until we've confirmed the situation on the ground." He couldn't justify a full-scale attack without knowing who they were truly fighting for. Even in war, he believed there had to be a line. The Elysium continued its steady approach toward Verdun 7, the weight of the coming decisions pressing on Graves' shoulders. It was clear that the Elysium would be a weapon of unparalleled might, but the question remained, would it be a force for justice, or would it become an instrument of tyranny? As the planet loomed ahead, the stars dimming against its atmosphere, Captain Graves knew that this mission would be the test of everything he had ever believed in. The Elysium glided silently into the orbit of Verdun 7, its immense form casting a long shadow over the troubled planet below. From the observation deck, Captain Graves gazed at the surface, the swirling clouds and rugged terrain that had once been a thriving world now scared by years of war. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of the unknown. "Status report, Commander," Graves asked, his voice steady but sharp. Commander Lena Grays appeared at his side, her eyes scanning the data flowing on her console. "Resistance forces are entrenched in the capital city, sir. We estimate around 2,000 soldiers. They've set up heavy defenses around key infrastructure. Civilian casualties are unclear, but multiple reports suggest the rebels are using them as human shields." Graves nodded, processing the information. The situation was more complicated than expected. If he followed through with the Empire's orders to neutralize the rebels swiftly, countless innocent lives would be caught in the crossfire. But if he hesitated, the rebellion could escalate into something far worse, and the Empire would lose control over the region. It was a fine line. Divert all non-essential power to the shields. Prepare for orbital bombardment, Graves commanded, his voice cold and resolute. The decision was made. They had to take control of the situation, quickly and decisively. As the crew worked in silence, the massive warship aligned itself above the capital city. Graves could see the sprawling metropolis below, where plumes of smoke rose from buildings already damaged by previous skirmishes. The rebels were entrenched, and from the looks of it, they had no intention of backing down. Lock on to the enemy's command center, Graves ordered. We'll eliminate their leadership first, and then deal with the remaining forces. The ship's main guns hummed to life, an eerie, almost mechanical sound reverberating through the hull. The Elysium's energy weapons were capable of targeting specific points with precision, but the sheer power they unleashed was destructive, surgical, yet catastrophic. "Captain, I advise caution," Commander Graves said, her voice laced with concern. "If we strike directly at the command center, we may cause more collateral damage. We can't be sure of the civilian locations in the area." Graves turned to her, his expression hardening. "I understand the risks, Commander, but this is the only way to end this quickly. We can't afford a prolonged conflict." The tension on the bridge reached a boiling point as the countdown began. Graves watched the readout on the holoscreen, the red light flashing, signaling the activation of the main cannon. Suddenly, a voice rang out across the command center. "Captain, we have incoming." The alarm blared. Graves whipped his head to the tactical screen. A group of enemy ships, smaller but fast, were approaching the Elysium. They must have been hiding in the nearby asteroid belt, waiting for the right moment to strike. The warship's sensors hadn't detected them until it was too late. "Bring shields to full power," Graves barked, gripping the armrests of his chair as the ship lurched under the force of enemy fire. The Elysium shuddered, but its reinforced hull absorbed the damage, and the ship retaliated with pinpoint laser strikes, vaporizing the incoming ships in seconds. For a moment, the bridge was silent as the Elysium regained its stability. Graves could feel his heart pounding in his chest. They had been close, too close. "Reassess the mission," Graves ordered, his tone a little sharper now. "We don't know who else is out there. Launch a ground team to secure communications with the rebels. We're not going in blind." The crew moved swiftly, adjusting their strategy. It was becoming clear that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. The rebels weren't just fighting for control. They were fighting for their lives, cornered in a war they couldn't win. Graves could feel the weight of their cause pressing against his own sense of duty. He had only one question left. Would his next decision lead to peace, or would it drive the galaxy one step closer to tyranny? As the Elysium moved into a tactical orbit above Verdun 7, the captain stared down at the planet below, the weight of his command heavy on his shoulders. The choices ahead were no longer clear-cut. The battle was over, at least for now. The Elysium hovered in low orbit above Verdun 7, its massive guns silent, its engines purring with the calm after the storm. Graves stood before the observation window, watching the swirling clouds below. The capital city, once a sprawling testament to prosperity, now lay in ruins. Rebel forces had been wiped out, but so had any chance of a clean victory. He could still hear the echoes of the blasts, the cries of the civilians caught in the crossfire, the ones who had paid the price for the Empire's mission. Graves could almost feel their gaze upon him, haunting him from below. Had he really just delivered the peace the Empire claimed it was bringing, or had he set the stage for something far darker? The bridge was quiet, the crew moving like ghosts, each lost in their own thoughts. Commander Graves stood beside him, her face grave, but her posture rigid. "Captain," she began, breaking the silence. "The mission was a success. The rebels are gone. The capital has been pacified. The Empire will be pleased." Graves didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the city's destruction, as if trying to find some shred of justification for the violence that had unfolded. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, heavy with doubt. "What price have we paid, Commander? How many innocent lives were lost because we were too quick to act?" Graves hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not sure, sir. We've already received reports from the ground teams. There are civilian casualties, yes, but they've been minimal compared to the scale of the rebellion. The majority of the damage occurred after we engaged. There are even reports that some of the rebels were using civilians as shields, forcing us into that position." Graves ran a hand through his hair, frustration building in him. "The Empire will spin this as a victory. But will anyone ask about the families torn apart, the children who will grow up orphaned, with nothing but hatred in their hearts for the Empire?" The silence that followed spoke volumes. Graves knew Graves had no easy answers, just as he didn't. This wasn't a simple military victory. It was a painful reminder of the costs of their so-called peace. Suddenly, the comms officer's voice cut through the tension. "Captain, incoming transmission from Imperial Command." Graves straightened, his mind shifting gears. "Put it through." A high-ranking officer appeared on the screen, his expression one of cold professionalism. "Captain Graves, your actions on Verdun 7 have been noted. The rebellion has been quelled, and control of the system is now secure. The Empire thanks you for your swift and decisive action." Graves' gaze didn't soften. "I trust you're aware of the civilian casualties, the destruction of the city." The officer's face didn't change. "Collateral damage is an unfortunate reality of military operations, Captain. The Empire's objective has been achieved. We'll rebuild the infrastructure. We'll ensure the people of Verdun 7 understand why this had to happen." "I'm sure they will," Graves said, his voice thick with irony. He paused, then added, "But tell me, how many more systems will fall under the Empire's peace like this? How many worlds will we save through destruction?" The officer didn't respond, the silence hanging between them like a thick fog. "Your orders are clear, Captain. Await further instructions." The transmission ended, leaving Graves to stew in his frustration. The Empire would never change its stance, would never truly see the damage they were causing. They would continue their march, turning worlds into battlefields, pretending that their weapons were the solution to every problem. Graves turned to Graves, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I didn't sign up for this, but it's clear I'm not going to change the Empire from within." Graves looked at him, knowing exactly what he meant. There were whispers on the ship, whispers about the Elysium being more than just a weapon, whispers about the ship's power being used for something other than conquest. "We need to prepare for the next mission," Graves said, his voice unwavering. "But we also need to understand the consequences of every move we make. We can't afford to ignore the cost of victory anymore." As the Elysium sailed away from Verdun 7, Captain Graves could only wonder if they had truly won anything at all. The galaxy was vast, and their reach was growing, but in the aftermath of that first battle, he couldn't shake the feeling that humanity's might was starting to resemble something much darker than justice, and that darkness, he feared, was only beginning to take root. The Elysium cut through space like a blade, its dark hull reflecting the stars as it made its way to the next mission. But for Captain Graves, the warship felt more like a prison, and the vastness of the galaxy beyond felt empty and cold. The cost of victory on Verdun 7 weighed heavily on him, and each passing moment only deepened his internal conflict. Was he leading the Elysium to greatness, or to something much darker? The mission at Verdun 7 had been a turning point. Despite the Empire's public proclamations of success, Graves knew that the rebellion's true nature was still unclear. He had made decisions in the heat of battle, decisions that, at the time, seemed necessary, but now left him with a gnawing unease. How many more worlds would they conquer with the same ruthless tactics? How many more innocent lives would be lost? As the Elysium moved toward its next destination, a newly discovered star system on the outskirts of Imperial space, Graves found himself staring out into the endless void, trying to sort through his thoughts. The voice of his first officer, Commander Lena Graves broke through the silence. "Captain, we've received a transmission from command. New orders are in." Graves sighed but turned to face her. "What are they?" "Another rebellion," Graves reported, her voice flat. "A group calling themselves the Uprising. They've taken control of a mining colony on Zeta 9. The Empire wants us to eliminate them immediately." Graves' heart sank. Another conflict. Another world on the brink of destruction. His gaze drifted to the tactical map of Zeta 9 that had just appeared on the screen. The planet was rich in resources, vital to the Empire's war machine, but it was also home to thousands of civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of the rebellion. "How large is their force?" Graves asked, though he already knew the answer. "Approximately 2,000 rebels, heavily armed," Graves replied. "But we've received intelligence suggesting the civilians are sympathetic to their cause. They've been providing food, shelter, and information to the insurgents." Graves took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. This was becoming a pattern, and one that didn't sit well with him. Every time the Empire wanted to assert its dominance, it seemed to demand the same solution: overwhelming force. The Elysium had the power to annihilate entire cities with one strike, but was that really what was needed? "Prepare a full tactical briefing," Graves ordered, his voice sharp. "I want to see all intel on the civilians, where they're located, how many of them there are, and whether there are any non-combatant evacuation options. This mission cannot be like Verdun 7. Graves glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "You're saying we delay. The Empire's orders are clear, Captain." "I'm saying we approach this carefully," Graves said, his voice unwavering. "We won't fire unless we know exactly who we're fighting. No more blind destruction." The commander nodded reluctantly, though the tension in her posture was evident. "Understood, sir." As the briefing continued, Graves couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every decision, every life that hung in the balance, felt like a step closer to a precipice. He knew what the Empire wanted: a quick resolution, a show of strength. But with each mission, the line between justice and tyranny blurred more and more. The Elysium's power was undeniable, but was it truly being wielded for the greater good? With Zeta 9 looming ahead, Graves had to confront a brutal truth. No matter how he approached this mission, no matter what precautions he took, the power of the Elysium was a weapon that could not be easily justified. And if he wasn't careful, he would become the very thing he had once sworn to fight against. The Elysium dropped out of faster-than-light travel and into the orbit of Zeta 9, the mining colony planet lying just beyond the reach of the Empire's established borders. From the observation deck, Captain Graves watched the rocky surface of the planet, dotted with large mining facilities and settlement clusters, but now tainted by the smoke rising from rebel skirmishes below. The planet was strategically vital to the Empire's war effort, rich in rare minerals that powered its military machinery. But it was also a powder keg ready to explode. Graves felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing against his chest as the planet's rough terrain came into view. Reports were conflicting. Some claimed that the civilian population had largely sided with the uprising, while others suggested they had been forced into supporting the rebellion out of fear. Either way, the mission was clear: neutralize the rebel forces, restore Imperial control, and bring order to the region. The Empire would not tolerate any challenge to its authority. "Captain, we have a full tactical analysis on the uprising's position," Graves said, breaking his reverie. She handed him a data pad with a detailed map of the rebel strongholds and the locations of major civilian clusters. "They're dug in, Captain. The rebels have entrenched themselves within the mining facilities, using them as barricades, but civilians are scattered all over the settlements." Graves scanned the information, noting the overlap between rebel positions and civilian zones. His mind raced. The Elysium could decimate the rebel strongholds with minimal effort, one clean strike, and the problem would be solved. But the civilians, could he really justify that kind of action again? After Verdun 7, he wasn't sure he could live with the same kind of destruction. "I need to speak with the Imperial Command," Graves said quietly, his voice distant. "We have to slow down. We need to negotiate with the civilian leadership first." Gray's eyes widened slightly. "Captain, are you suggesting we—" She cut herself off, looking around at the bridge officers who were quietly listening. "The Empire's orders are clear, sir. They expect results." "I know," Graves replied, turning to face her fully. "But these aren't just rebels anymore. These are people caught in the crossfire. We can't approach this like we did Verdun 7. Graves didn't argue, but her expression spoke volumes. She knew that Graves was right, but she also knew that defying the Empire's orders could have serious consequences. Still, she held her ground. "Understood, Captain. I'll work with the ground teams to prepare a more diplomatic approach. But we'll need to move fast." Graves gave a curt nod, his mind racing through the potential outcomes. The more he considered it, the clearer the path became. He had to find a way to neutralize the threat without resorting to the same overwhelming tactics that had led to so many civilian deaths before. But time was against him. As the Elysium moved into a closer orbit, Graves turned to his communications officer. "Send a message to the civilian leaders of Zeta 9. Let them know we're here to negotiate, but they have to stand down the uprising." The clock ticked down on the negotiations. Graves stood in the command center, eyes fixed on the holographic display of Zeta 9. As the minutes passed with agonizing slowness, the rebel forces were entrenched in the mining facilities, and scattered pockets of civilians remained in the settlement zones, some unwilling to leave, others too frightened to move. Tensions were running high. Every moment without a resolution made the situation more precarious. Commander Graves approached, her expression tight. "Captain, the civilian leaders have agreed to meet with us in an hour. They want to negotiate, but they're asking for assurance that we won't target their people." Graves nodded, relieved yet wary. "What about the rebels? Do they have any intention of standing down?" "They say they'll hold the line as long as they can," Graves said, the edge in her voice betraying her frustration. "They're not willing to surrender unless we promise them a safe passage out. But with the Empire's stance, that seems unlikely." Graves ran a hand through his hair, his mind whirling. The Empire would never give in to such demands, especially to rebels who had caused so much disruption. But that didn't mean Graves could simply ignore their requests. If he chose to ignore the civilians' plea for mercy and opted for a full assault, the resulting bloodshed would haunt him forever. His mind flashed back to Verdun 7, to the ruined city and the innocent lives lost in the name of peace. "The people of Zeta 9 aren't our enemies," Graves said, his voice firm. "They're caught in the middle of something they didn't start. We need to find a way to extract the rebels without further violence." Graves looked skeptical, but nodded. "I'll work with our ground teams to prepare for an extraction, but if the rebels don't comply, the Elysium can't hold back. We'll be forced to engage." Graves stared at the display, his chest tight. He knew what the Elysium was capable of, what it could do. It could end the rebellion in a heartbeat, reduce the mining colony to ashes, and restore imperial order with a single strike. Yet the more he thought about it, the more the weight of that power felt like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. The tension in the air on the bridge was palpable as Graves weighed his options. His hands were clenched into fists, the decision pressing on him like a physical weight. He couldn't let Zeta 9 become another Verdun 7. He couldn't let this warship become a tool of mindless destruction. But how could he achieve peace when he was ordered to bring war? An alarm beeped suddenly, snapping Graves from his thoughts. The communication officer's voice cut through the tension. "Captain, we've received a direct transmission from the Civilian Council." Graves turned to face the officer. "Put it through." A projection of a woman in her late 40s appeared on the screen. She had the weathered look of someone who had seen too many battles, but there was a resoluteness in her eyes. She spoke with authority, but also with an air of weariness that struck Graves deeply. "We know the Elysium's power, Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the desperation in her eyes. "But we're asking for a chance to stand down the rebels without further bloodshed. Please, don't turn our world into another Verdun 7. Graves' throat tightened as he listened to her plea. She wasn't asking for victory. She was asking for mercy. "Do you speak for the rebels as well?" Graves asked, his voice measured. She shook her head. "No, Captain. The rebels will fight until the end, but we don't have to die with them." The silence that followed was deafening. Graves stood at the edge of a precipice. He could issue the order to fire, to crush the rebellion and the planet along with it. Or he could defy his orders, put everything on the line for a chance at a better resolution. But either way, he knew he would never be the same. "I will negotiate with them," Graves said quietly, his resolve hardening. "But the Empire will not like this. Prepare for the worst." Graves exchanged a glance with the other officers, but she said nothing. They all knew what was at stake now. As Graves made his way toward the meeting room, the weight of the decision bore down on him. There was no turning back. This was the line in the sand, the point where everything changed, and he wasn't sure if it would lead to redemption or ruin. Captain Graves stood before the conference table, his hands resting on the cold metal surface. The civilian representative from Zeta 9, a woman named Eliana Kor, sat across from him. Her face was lined with the stress of the past few days, but her eyes were sharp, filled with both fear and hope. The room was silent, the tension palpable. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Captain," Eliana began, her voice steady but tinged with desperation. "The rebels won't lay down their arms. They're fighting for their survival, for their homes, and they'll die before they let the Empire take control of this planet again." Graves nodded, his mind weighing her words. The rebels, like so many others, were fighting because they felt they had no other choice. They had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves against an empire that demanded their submission, and now they stood on the brink of annihilation. "I understand that," Graves said quietly, his gaze fixed on Eliana. "But the Elysium has the firepower to obliterate your people. We could level these settlements, end the rebellion in an instant, and the Empire would not blink an eye." Eliana's face hardened. "And what would that make you, Captain?" Another officer in a long line of conquerors, willing to burn everything down for the Empire's peace. "Is that what you want?" The question struck Graves like a physical blow. He didn't know how to respond. He had spent his career following orders, upholding the Empire's vision of order through strength. But the weight of Eliana's words, the truth behind them, sank deep into his chest. Was he truly just a tool of destruction? Was the peace the Empire promised worth the cost? "I don't want to destroy anyone," Graves finally said, his voice quieter now, more conflicted. "But I have a duty. I have a responsibility to my crew, to the Empire. If I defy orders, the consequences could be far worse." Eliana looked at him, as if weighing his sincerity. Then her gaze softened, just slightly. "Then help us, Captain. Help us save what's left of Zeta 9. We're not asking you to join our cause, but to at least give us the chance to make a real peace. Tell your Empire that we're ready to stand down, but only if they meet us halfway." Graves felt a pang of frustration. He could see her point. He could see the humanity in her plea. But he knew how the Empire worked. They would never negotiate with insurgents. They only understood power. He was stuck between two worlds, one that demanded loyalty to a brutal, unquestioning system, and another that was asking for the very thing that seemed impossible: mercy. "If I give this order," Graves muttered, more to himself than to Eliana, "it could mean the end of my career. The Empire won't tolerate a failure here. And if I refuse, if I compromise, I'll be labeled a traitor." Eliana leaned forward, her voice steady. "Then what is your career worth, Captain? What is your duty worth if it means condemning innocent people to death? If you allow this planet to burn, what kind of man will you be when it's all over?" Graves stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. For the first time, he truly questioned everything he had stood for, the endless years of unquestioning service to the Empire. Was this what he wanted? Was this the man he had become? "I'm not sure who I am anymore," Graves said quietly, his gaze distant. The silence stretched between them, thick with the unsaid. Graves knew that whatever choice he made next would define not just the fate of Zeta-9, but his own future. Eliana broke the silence. "Then make the choice, Captain. Do what you know is right, even if the Empire doesn't understand it." Graves stood, his mind racing. His hand rested on the console that controlled the communication channels. The fate of Zeta-9, of its people, and of his own soul rested in his hands. He could give the order to engage, to destroy, and end the rebellion. Or he could defy the Empire, a risk he had never imagined himself willing to take. The decision was his. Captain Graves stood before the console, his hand hovering over the communication controls. The silence in the room felt like it was pressing in on him, suffocating him. His fingers trembled ever so slightly. The decision to send a message to Imperial Command, or to take matters into his own hands, was one that would alter the course of history. He could no longer keep avoiding the truth. The consequences of this moment would stretch far beyond Zeta-9. Behind him, Eliana Kor waited, her gaze intense but patient. She had made her case. Now it was Graves' turn to make his. Every instinct screamed at him to follow orders, to be the officer the Empire expected him to be. But after everything he had seen, the destruction of Verdun 7, the pain on the faces of the civilians, he knew something had changed within him. Graves glanced at her one last time, her determined expression reflected in the glass paneling of the command center. "You say that we can make peace," he said quietly. "But can we really? Can one side, any side, truly walk away from this war with its hands clean?" Eliana didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a breath and looked out the observation window, staring at the desolate landscape below. "Peace never comes easily, Captain," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's still worth fighting for, even if the cost is high. We don't have to be enemies. Not forever." Her words hit Graves like a hammer. He had spent so many years believing that the Empire's version of peace, order through power, through the suppression of rebellion, was the only way forward. But what if there was another way? What if this moment, right here, was the turning point? He turned toward the console, fingers now poised over the controls. He had to choose. The Empire's order, or the future of Zeta-9 and the lives of its people. It would be a decision that could destroy his career or his soul. But for the first time, Graves knew that his true duty wasn't to the Empire. It was to those who had no voice in this fight. He pressed the comms button. "This is Captain Graves of the Elysium," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "To Imperial Command, I am initiating a ceasefire on Zeta-9. I'm putting forward an official request for negotiations between the rebels and the civilian council. We will not engage unless direct hostilities are resumed. I repeat, we are halting all military action until further notice." The line crackled for a moment. Graves held his breath as he awaited a response. He knew the consequences of his defiance. The Empire would not be pleased, and they would likely see his actions as treason. But there was no turning back now. After what felt like an eternity, the cold voice of Imperial Command came through the line, flat and emotionless. "Captain Graves, you are in direct violation of Imperial orders. Cease all further actions and prepare for immediate accountability. You will face consequences for this disobedience." Graves didn't flinch. "Understood," he replied. "But Zeta-9 deserves a chance for peace. The Empire can take that from them, or it can work with them. The choice is theirs." The comms officer ended the transmission without further comment. Graves stared at the screen, his heart pounding, his body tense. His future was uncertain. His loyalty to the Empire had always been unquestioned, but now He realized that loyalty had come at the expense of everything he believed in. Aliena stepped forward slowly, watching him with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "You did it," she said softly. "You chose." Graves turned toward her, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. "I chose a chance. Whether it's enough, I can't say." Outside, the ships of the Elysium remained poised, ready to launch an assault if ordered. But for now, the ship hung in the balance, as did the fate of Zeta 9. Graves had made his choice, but the reckoning was just beginning.